let me explain and show to you my method of drawing freehand directly in ink without any pencil underlining to keep proportions as accurate as I can. And this wagon, with its somewhat irregular form and shapes, is a great example for that. So firstly, I choose where I start carefully. I choose something which I think will help me position everything else fairly readily, and something that won't be too hard to draw. So I choose this wheel that's closest to us. Now it's roughly circular, but always careful observation. And I'm noticing that it is swiveled slightly away from me on the left-hand side. So it's an ellipse. And I also notice that at the base of the wheel, we have grass growing up. And so I don't rush to do an outline there. Now, because this is a very weathered surface, this old timber, really falling apart timber wagon, it will be forgiving on marks being not perfect. So that's great, and that will help offset the fact that it's going to be fairly tricky. And it's also going to be a bit tricky because we can't really see all the detail clearly. And while we can examine the photo carefully, we can't go past the photo. And even though I took this photo in Tasmania, in Australia, it's hard to remember exactly how things looked in the shadow. So I'm starting with the wheel. I start with trying to get the major shape of it done, paying attention to foreshortening, which means that the left-hand side width of this rim is narrower than the right-hand side because it's further away from me. This is foreshortening at work. Foreshortening affects everything we see, not just architecture. And so now I'm positioning these spokes, and sometimes some things when we draw are more important than others. A lot of the detail of this wagon doesn't have to be hugely precise for it not to really notice, but these spokes are not in that category. We really want to get them as accurately, as closely as possible to being equal. So knowing what to really concentrate on is an important part of drawing freehand. And I also need to notice that I have an outer edge and I have a width. So now I'm adding some depth lines for this hub, and now I'm adding my width for these spokes and observing where the shadow falls on them. And that last one I didn't actually have that much shadow on it. So it's also noticing how what we see of the width of the spoke changes depending where the spoke is. So the 2 o'clock and 8 o'clock positions, we don't really see the depth. And so now, adding some hatching on this wheel hub section, the end of the axle. As I said, this is a fairly quick drawing for the detail, and I am quite happy to use a fairly rustic, which maybe is a nice way of saying rough, finish on it, because I think that's going to tie in very happily with the subject. But it is important to get this wheel as accurate as I can. Firstly, because it's more geometric and therefore it's more obvious if it's not right. Secondly, it's visually very prominent, it's in the center, and it's the largest easily recognizable object we have here. And now I'm doing the rim. And because I'm going to use it, and this perhaps is even the most significant reason, I'm going to use it as a reference point and as a measuring stick for everything else I draw. So having positioned this first wheel, the next thing in my process is to work out what I'm going to do next, and it's going to be this second wheel. And what I need to do is basically draw this second wheel without bothering to draw what's in between. If I'm happy enough with the accuracy of my first wheel, now I can use it to align my second wheel, and you noticed I did a few dots for where I thought that this wheel would go. And I position those dots by doing horizontal lines from, say, the top of this left-hand wheel and seeing how far above the right-hand wheel was that. Even noticing that it's higher than the right wheel, even though it's further away, is one of those significant observation things that, in my experience with students, it's the sort of thing that is easily and often missed. You'll notice that my original mark for the bottom of the wheel went down too far because I wasn't allowing for the grass and for the sinking into the ground effect. But what I have allowed for is the fact that this wheel is actually angled away from us more. It's more twisted on the left-hand side away from us than the closer wheel is. And that changes the shape in that it makes this circle even more of an ellipse than the first one was. And again, that's the sort of detail, if we don't observe it carefully, then we can't draw it. So if you look at the gap between the hub and the rim, we can see that the spokes look like they're much shorter. Of course, they're all the same size, but because of the angle, some of them, well, all of them are more foreshortened than the closer wheel, and because of the position, particularly, as in the first case, the 8 o'clock and 2 o'clock position spokes look the shortest of all. And so now it's the same thing. It's good, I find, when I'm drawing identical objects to, as far as I can, draw them in the same order, in the same way. And that helps to link how they look, helps them to look the same. As you can see, I'm using a 0.3 Copic multi-liner here. And I'm drawing on 210 GSM drawing cartridge. It's an Australian brand of drawing pad called Art Tech, but it's made in Australia from paper imported from Germany. So just working out now the shadowed areas, or rather the shaded areas of this wheel. Okay, so adding the 3 dimensions on the inside rim, on the side that we can see that, and then do the same thing, I presume, yep, for the other wheel. So now we have the 2 wheels positioned, and now we get to add the cart in between them. And so the question is, what's the best line to do now? And so I've identified a line in the base that is a straight line. So it's not the edge that we see, but there is a line where I presume there's some timber joining where we get a complete straight line. So I position that, and then I do the line which now disappears behind the wall. And this way it's easier to keep all of these relationships accurate. And now you see, to get the, if you like, height of the wagon above the wheel, I look at the vertical line because I am trying to draw this actual size. Now my drawing is turning out, I think, a little bit larger, but it's close enough for the purpose and for the briskness of this drawing. If a line's not quite right, then I reposition it in most cases. So now I'm looking at this broken bit of timber that goes across the back, and I'm not really thinking of it as a long piece that goes the width. I'm just trying to see it as a shape, as if it were a cutout shape on the paper, and I'm trying to draw the same shape with the same angles and widths and lengths as the photo has. And so now you can see I've actually drawn a shadow as my next part, or it's rather a shaded piece of timber. And you can see that little lit, those couple of lit bits of, well, they're probably bolts. And now there's a piece of timber that's still reasonably in one piece and with reasonably smooth sides going across. So you can see at this stage what I'm doing. Although a lot of this is not very clear, I'm drawing the bits that are clear firstly, so that I get them in the right position in relation to the wheels. So you see me checking the angle there. That I get the clear parts in the right position, because if I start drawing the bits that aren't really clear, it's going to be easy for them not to be as accurate, and then that's going to push the scale and the consistency, the proportions of the whole thing in different directions. So focus on getting some key elements that are easier to see, position them carefully, and then see how it goes. Now you'll see that that piece I'm doing right now, in the reference, it hits the wheel at the 2 o'clock spoke. So I've approximately done that. I probably could have done it thinner than that. It's a little bit lower than it should be, and that's because I think my beams above it are a little bit too wide. But again, I don't have a problem with that for this drawing. It is always easier to see where things aren't quite right when we watch it being drawn afterwards without the pressure of actually having to do the drawing. But it is a useful thing to do. And if you've never recorded drawings and then played it back and really observed what you're doing and checked it for how the accuracy goes as you go, it is a really useful thing to do. So now I'm getting into the parts. Once I start to get behind the wheel, I'm getting into the parts where it's really difficult to work out exactly what's happening. And while I can see there are some shadowed and sunlit parts of timber going behind the wheel, I don't really know what they're doing, or particularly what they join up with as they move from left to right. So this is another great example of drawing the effect of the detail. I'm just trying to capture the pattern of the lights, the shadows, the light and dark. I'm not trying to draw the detail. And quite frankly, with this size pen, drawing this size, I'd have a lot of trouble capturing the detail, I think. So now there's a wheel that we see a bit of on the far side. And so I've put that in place. And again, I've related it to what I've already drawn. So on the reference, that wheel lines up with the 9 o'clock spoke. And so that's what I've done here. So now possibly the more complicated section. There is approximately the back edge, pretty ragged, but it is a back edge of the wagon. And I've aligned that with the 2 o'clock spoke, and it sort of continues off at about the same angle as the spoke. And again, this is the sort of observation that lets us then draw it more accurately. So having got where it is and the angle correct, it's only the length of that line that I need to worry about. And I'm not thinking about that just yet, because I figure if I draw the wheel now first, and I draw it the same way I've drawn the other wheels, which is in reference to the first wheel I drew, that will help me position the length. See, I can already see that that line's really gone maybe even a fraction too far out to the left, or maybe it's sort of just right, but it wouldn't want to be even a tiny bit longer. And so the order in which we do things when we're drawing freehand in ink is really important to keep things in the right proportion, because if we take a line too far, it's tempting to join it up with our drawing, and that will throw the proportions out. I would have just left a couple of millimeters of line going too far if I felt that I really couldn't take that back line of the wagon to that point. So now, continuing really to try and see the key shadows, and there is this section where there's 3 sunlit areas, and then there are some shadows being cast by some vertical supports from the other side. And then there's several layers of timber which are really hard to work out. And so my rule of thumb is, if there's ambiguity in the photo for this size photo, then I want to try and capture that ambiguity in my drawing. It's better to capture the ambiguity than to try and make up detail that you can't see. It's almost impossible to have that detail look credible, in my experience anyway. And now I'm looking at what we can see of this wheel. And I'm doing the hub first, and then I'll do the spoke, the rim around it and the spokes around it. So I'm making some adjustments as I draw. Adding a few of the weathered marks where the timber's cracking at this point. Probably just trying to give myself time to think before I start to commit again. This is where we really have to keep our wits about us. As it starts to emerge, it's easy to ease off on our concentration. And it's always a real shame if we mess something up through lack of care, through being distracted. We're going to get things not quite right simply because we're learning a new skill. And that's part of the learning experience, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's very productive. But it's always discouraging if we mess something up because we were careless. So keeping our wits about us is important. Now, the shadow that's on the ground, I think, is an important part of this, particularly the more interesting shadows we have on the right-hand side. It's easy to forget shadows or to do them carelessly. While perhaps we couldn't have drawn the shadow for this without the reference, we do know there's a shadow there, and if we saw a photo, say, where the shadow was photoshopped to be all distorted, we'd probably be able to tell that it didn't look right. And that's why when I draw something such as a shadow, I work as hard as I can to get it accurate, both with the reference, but also with what I've already drawn and with the direction of the sunlight. And again, exactly how we do the shadows on the ground depends a bit on a few things. One is what the surface of the ground is, and the other is how much time we've got. But you can see what I'm doing already between the two wheels on our side of the cart, of the wagon. The grass, while it's pretty short, generally, there is grass that's sticking up which is catching the shadow, and so I've done that as the upper limit of the shadow. And when I come round to doing the rest of it, I'm hoping that's going to in some way help define the shadow in a way that captures the effect, visually the effect of the shadow. Putting a sharp edge, drawing straight lines for this shadow would indicate both that the wagon was in tip-top condition, but also that the ground was very smooth, and neither of them are true. And that's why we want to find marks that capture the effect of the reality that's in our reference. So I can easily do a bit of a jagged line on that left-hand section. Just feeling a bit of the... Now, again, how carefully I want to follow this exactly is one of those things I'll need to just consider. This is meant to be a fairly quick overall drawing. And we want to keep the same consistency overall with our drawing in terms of the briskness of the line work. And while for me it's quite common that I have a central focus which is drawn with more care, in more detail, that becomes more loose, more more gestural as we move in all directions away from that, it still is important, I think, to overall have a consistency, a coherency in our line work, in our mark making, that it feels like it was all done in the same session with the same mindset of style and of how the finished work is going to look. We don't want different parts to look like they were done by different people. And so now I'm really just trying to get the values, the darknesses, and not worrying too much about what's causing them. So now just getting some of these shadows on the grass. And I'm not being, as I said before, as exact as I might have been, or perhaps I've just got a few more to draw. Let's just see. And if this was a far more detailed picture, maybe if I were drawing it a bit larger, I'd be taking more care to get that effect in the foreground of the grass that's coming up, catching the sunlight, that stands up in front of the shadowed area behind. And now, before I do the final finishing on the wagon, I want to try and give some hint of the building behind. Now, I wouldn't normally have probably bothered with this because the wagon really was the subject. But because it is a house, a building that's of the same era, structurally, as the wagon, I think it's going to be nice to include it. So that's what I'm doing here. And you can see all the positioning marks I use before I do the line to help me get the curve I want, whatever mark I want, as accurately as possible. And you'll see how I did that fairly shallow curve. I found its starting point and its landing point, marks there, the mark for where it was going to meet up. I had a sense of how shallow that curve was going to be, and then I did it in two parts. For me personally, that works a lot more accurately than trying to do it in one sweep. It's always good to know our personal limits with curves and to adapt to that. Sometimes it's really good to do a line in one go as far as we can. But invariably, it still looks more effective to have a joined curve that's accurate than a continuous line that's not. And this becomes relatively straightforward now because I'm able to position all of these elements, these vertical elements, with the wagon. And so firstly, in the reference, I look to see where these columns are, what part of the wagon they connect to, and then I do that with my drawing. And this is why the rhythm picks up, the tempo picks up when we start to draw. It's not that we're trying to go faster, but we simply can. And again, there is a danger that comes with this advantage, and that's that we don't feel the need to look as carefully at our reference. We feel like we know what we're doing. We feel like we've seen what we need to see. And there's every chance we haven't, and we need to have another look. So a little bit of mark for the shadow. A couple of easy marks for the concreted veranda area, and now hatching for the door. Now I did this about 18 months ago, maybe even a bit longer, this drawing, and I do the hatching vertically. If I were doing this again, or if I were doing this now, I would have the hatching at a slight angle, because it's still fundamentally on the vertical side of direction, but at a slight angle, because I feel in that way it competes less with the vertical lines that we have in the actual structure. And so I think it would add more clarity to tilt the verandaed shadowed area more more distinctively. This was a very different subject for me to draw, and that can be a very helpful thing to do, because it does push our process, our drawing process, our understanding of what drawing is and how we do it. If we're drawing similar sorts of things over and over again, we can just develop fairly automatic ways of doing it and not really kind of work at having the understanding of our process that is helpful. We also can start to draw things from memory, which when we look at our drawing, look close enough because we're able to approximate quite accurately the sorts of subjects we draw. But problem is, when we go to draw something that is different, we don't have that to work on or to use. And so if we're not then observing our reference as much as we should, because we've got out of the habit of doing that, suddenly we think, oh, I can't draw that thing. And it's not that any one thing is really any harder than any other thing. Everything we draw requires the same drawing process, whatever our drawing process is. It's not that it's harder, it's just that we're not as familiar with how our drawing process applies to that subject. And there's no reason why we need to draw every subject. We might as well enjoy the things we like. But it does help us develop our drawing process if sometimes we step out of our usual things. So these vertical strokes I'm doing now, this is what I was talking about. If these were angled slightly, then they wouldn't compete so much with the vertical lines of the structure, which now are getting lost. This door frame area with all these vertical lines is getting a bit lost in these hatching lines. So that's something I've changed since I did this, and something which I think was a very worthwhile change. And again, always critique our drawing when we've done it. And it's not just, is it accurate or not? It's not just, are the angles right? But it is things like, has this technique worked? Is it delivering the results that I was hoping for? And I just want to give a hint of the large sandstone blocks in this building, because I think that combined with the actual subject helps give a sense of the historic nature of this scene and of this building. Hatching is one of those things we do need to learn patience to do. Many a drawing has been ruined at the last minute through hasty hatching, which doesn't angle consistently, or is too heavy, or too messy. So what I'm going to do here is come from both directions, up and down. And that will help me have more accurate finishes on each side. And I'm wanting the top to be a little bit darker. Although I'm not actually showing that. At this point, I'm trying to match up with the sort of lines I've done before. But they're really, in my mind, they're really too far apart. There's not a problem so much with the grass, I don't think, but these lines are too far apart. Quite possibly, if I'd used a 0.1mm pen too, I could have done them closer together and still kept a lighter value. So now I've got the final wagon marks, and then finish off that hatching. Again, notice I'm very happy with a fairly rough finish to the wagon, because in my mind that helps capture the rustic, weathered nature. And even things such as getting that unkempt grass that's around the wheels, that also adds to the feel, to creating the feel. So now I'm just finishing these last hatching lines. Please hit the like button if you're finding this interesting, finding it's helpful. I did a live YouTube session this morning, and we ended up talking quite a lot about the importance of our drawing process, of having a drawing process that we understand and that we use, and how having one means that we can then change it and develop it, which is really important as we learn new things or discover that some things don't work well, or simply we've discovered something that works better. But if we have an understanding of what we're doing when we're drawing, that gives us direction and confidence with the marks that we put on the paper and with the order in which we do things. Sometimes the materials that we use, popping this pathway in, and getting very close to the end, I would think. What do you think? How's it looking? Please hit that like button for me, and why not hit notifications and know when I've posted a new drawing. I've really enjoyed doing this series of revoicing over real-time video of some of my earlier drawings, because I'm more convinced than ever of the benefits of watching drawings in real time and getting an understanding of not just the time commitment and the patience, but also what's a reasonable speed to try and draw. If we watch videos constantly sped up, it's easy to think that that's how fast we can draw them, because it feels like that's a reasonable speed. We've seen so many zip, zip, zip drawings. And even if I were to make this double speed, even though it's twice as fast as I'm drawing, in my opinion, it sometimes even can be still mistaken for the real time. And so we can not realize how much something is sped up, even when we realize it is. And if I can't draw this twice as fast, I don't really want to give you the impression that I can, because that doesn't set you up with realistic expectations, and it means you're likely to be practicing drawing too fast. And that's always going to slow you down, ironically. Practicing too fast will mean more mistakes, less understanding, less observation, because there isn't time for it. And that's not going to be a helpful thing. In fact, you can start to entrench bad habits that can then be very hard to break. So a realistic understanding of the time it takes to draw something can be had by watching real-time drawing videos. And I have a couple of playlists organised in different ways that have more of these videos, some shorter than this one, some longer than this one. And, some people have said too, it's quite soothing watching me draw at real time. So, what do you think? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Great subject. Always good to step out of our comfort zone and do some things that are a bit different and apply our process, our technique to a different subject. But hey, in the end, whatever you draw, whatever process you use to draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.